Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. So I titled this talk Science versus Religion, and then after that I kind of got to thinking that's not exactly what I meant, because I'm really focused more on the Bible. Religion, of course, is usually in conflict with science. When you have two different methods of finding truth, there's bound to be conflict at some point. And religion isn't perfect. I will argue the Bible is, but religion is not perfect, and so it makes a more difficult explanation when you talk about science versus religion, rather than actually science versus the Bible. So that's really what I'm going to focus on, is the Bible more reliable than science? So why should you listen to me? Well, I live in both worlds. I am a scientist, and I'm a Christian. I have a PhD in mechanical engineering. I'm a professor here at State. I got my degree here too. I've published a number of journal articles, been cited several times. I've done the normal things that scientists do, and I'm fairly typical for where I am in my career at my age, I would say. I'm also a Christian. I'm active in church, and I'm passionate about that as well. Okay, thank you. So, I am a Christian. Good check, San Juan. But I don't want to hear myself again. I'm active in church and so forth and so on. So I have stakes in both sides. You broke it. Let's see. I think there we are. Let me see. Is it working now? Yes. Thank you. All right. So what is the conflict? The conflict is basically this. The Bible says quite explicitly that God created the world in 6 days. It uses that as why we should honor the Sabbath as a day of rest. So it's pretty obviously literally 7 days, not 7 periods of time. The Sabbath is not a period of time. So that doesn't make sense otherwise. Also, it says very clearly that sin entered the world through one man, and death entered the world through sin. Before that, the world is described as perfect. Now, the mainstream consensus in science says that organisms have evolved into more complex forms over millions of years. That process is driven by natural selection, in which organisms that are the least fit die off first, and the ones that are the most fit survive the best. That process explicitly is driven by death. And so it has no place trying to intermingle with this sin into the world and death through sin. Those are not compatible with each other. So what do you do about it? You have to acknowledge they do conflict. Now, you can try to intermingle the different ideas in various ways. You can accept one as primary and then reconcile the other one to it. There's lots of different things you can do, but you have to admit that they definitely are in conflict. Now, with that said, most of the stuff that people talk about is not whether they conflict or not. It's not whether there's a controversy between science and religion. People start by asking that, but what they really spend most of their time talking about is which one is more reliable. How do you gauge the reliability of the Bible? How do you gauge the reliability of science? And that's an important question. I mean, that's one we have to deal with if we want to have an answer. If we want to be able to reconcile these things, you're going to have to decide which one is more reliable than the other one if you want to get anywhere. So, if you put it in a table, I like tables, you can put out 4 different possibilities of what you believe as far as which one is infallible versus fallible. Yeah, that's a gauge of perfect reliability. And that's important because the Bible claims explicitly to be infallible. It claims to be perfect, the Word of God, the Word of the perfect God. Science claims to be getting more reliable over time. That's the way it works. So that means that science explicitly claims to not be infallible. It claims to not be perfect because you can't get better over time if you're already perfect. So that means if we look at these 4 different categories, the top 2 are kind of ruled out because obviously they can't both be infallible because they don't agree with each other. Secondly, if you say that science is infallible, that's not what it claims to be. And also, if the Bible is fallible, that's not what it claims to be. So that's kind of an awkward thing to believe. I mean, why would you believe that when neither one says that? Now, if you look at the bottom 2, if you put the Bible as infallible, that puts it primary over science explicitly. Then you can have a consistent working philosophy, a way to view the world. Also, if you believe that both of them are fallible, you can have a consistent philosophy, you just can't know anything for sure. You have complete uncertainty, you have no way of knowing anything for sure. A lot of people think that way. I mean, you just have different relative certainties. So let's talk about the reliability of science. Science is based on iteration. Now, that's a nice word. I like that word. Merriam-Webster's defines iteration as a procedure in which repetition of a sequence of operations yields results successively closer to a desired result. Makes perfect sense, right? Merriam-Webster's is not always the best at succinctly describing an idea. But if you kind of read it slowly and think about what it's saying you're going to do the same thing over and over again, and you're going to get closer and closer to your objective every time you do it. So you have some kind of objective, and you have this method that you just repeat it over and over, and it gets better. You know, it's like lots of things in real life, like sanding a piece of wood. I thought of, you sand it, it gets a little smoother. You sand it again, it gets smoother again, and so on. Hopefully, I mean, sometimes you scratch it, but nothing's perfect, except the Bible. The scientific method is an iterative method. It is a method that works by repeating the same sequence of operations. You have a theory, you gather data, you analyze the data, compare it to your theory, you modify your theory as needed, you gather data, you analyze the data, so on, to infinity. Here's an example of what iteration is like. This is an iterative procedure to approximate the square root of 2. Now, you all know that the square root of 2, you can put it in your calculator and get the answer, but pretty much nobody has no idea how the calculator gets that answer, right? Because there's not a formula for the square root of 2. In fact, it's been proven that there can't be a formula for the square root of 2. So how does the calculator do it? It uses a procedure like this. Not this exact one, because there's better ones, but much like this. So you start with a guess. You have a method of figuring out how far off your guess is. And then you use that error to refine your guess. Very much like the scientific method. So I'm going to take this for example. You start with the 3/2, 1.5. That seems somewhat reasonable because the square of 1 is 1, the square of 2 is 4. So whatever the square root of 2 is has to be between 1 and 2. So we'll start with 1.5. Now, if you take that and square it, if it's exactly correct, the error should be 0. But it's not exactly correct. 3/2 squared is 9/4, while 2 is 8/4. So the error is 1/4. From which you can derive a new guess value. 3/2 minus 1/8, which is what? 11/8. Then you find the error again. 121/64 minus 2 is negative 7/64, and so on. I will not try to go further in my head. But within 3 or 4 steps, you'll be getting into the third decimal place of what the square root of 2 is. And you can verify that by doing it with your calculator, which kind of makes the point, but it works. That's the way iteration works. And there's iterative ways of finding all sorts of things that you can't find directly. That's how science works, because you can't just know the right formula for describing the motion of a particle. I mean, the math isn't written on it. You have to guess and then approximate, see how far off you are, modify your theory, and so on. Sometimes it's possible with an iterative method to find the exact solution. Other times you can only approximate it closer and closer forever. But either way, you can get the answer to within whatever error you deem acceptable, if you just do this steps over and over again enough. So does it work? We all know that by and large it does work extremely well, because we see all the results of it around us. But that being said, there are a lot of problems. Here's some of the major pitfalls that I've seen that are common in science. And they're common in all sorts of things that people do, because these are just things that people have problems with, because we're not perfectly logical beings. Confirmation bias. We think because we got the right answer, that the way we did it must have been right too. It is possible to get the right answer with the wrong way of doing it. Sometimes there's multiple theories compatible with evidence. If you start with the wrong guess value in that iteration, you'll end up with a negative number, which is also the square root of 2, because 2 has a negative square root as well. The same method can find both of them, just depending on what your guess value is. But the same thing is true with lots of evidence, lots of methods. Just by changing something in a very slight way, you can end up with something quite different. And the scientific method is susceptible to that problem. The bandwagon fallacy. You assume that because everybody else thinks this way, it must be right. It just assumes that other people are perfect, which is not a great assumption usually. Causal fallacy. Just because this one thing happens with this other thing does not mean one caused the other. Maybe the other one caused that one. Maybe they were both caused by something else. Maybe it was just a happen chance. Could have been all sorts of things. But the scientific method, we're particularly prone to that kind of reasoning, because we can repeat it and then see it happen that way again. And then we just think, well, definitely this is causing that. Just like originally they thought that meat, when it decayed, caused flies. Circular reasoning. My data is accurate because it agrees with my hypothesis, and my hypothesis is right because it agrees with my data. And as crazy as that sounds, people do it all the time, myself included. And finally, suppression of negative data. It's very hard to publish a result that didn't come out right. People don't want to see results unless they agree with your theories. So a lot of times, the results that don't agree are simply not ever published, not ever widely known. And so theories fail to get falsified. That's part of the scientific method. You falsify the wrong theories. That does not happen nearly as often or as easily as it should. So I titled this slide, How the Sausage is Made, because a lot of people have a very idealized view of how science gets done. And I wanted to show you some of the inside and just how bad it can get. And that is the process of peer review. So most scientific advances are deemed successful when you manage to get them published. The process of publication is you send your manuscript to a journal. The journal assigns an editor that is more or less a specialist in your topic area. They usually have a fairly decent high-level view of it, but don't understand exactly what you did. They then try to find experts in the field that are the best people to understand your work. They send your paper to them to review it, to get very specific feedback on all the different things you did, your conclusions, your reasoning, your data quality, and the verdict, whether or not it should be published. Now, the reviewers do not determine whether it's published or not. The editor makes the call. But most of the time, they just go with what the reviewers recommend. Now, once something makes it through that and gets published, a lot of people just assume that it must be completely reliable work because it passed peer review. And peer review is this time-honored tradition that is how we verify work. However, fairly recently, only 5 years ago, Nature did a survey of some of their authors. Nature is one of the best journals. They publish really high-level stuff, really significant advances. And they did a survey of their authors, and they asked them if they had tried to reproduce their colleagues' work and whether or not they were successful. 70% said that they had tried and could not reproduce major findings that were published in the journal. Moreover, half of them failed to reproduce their own findings. So that's a more strict standard than peer review. Peer review means, people just read your work and tried to make sure it made sense. Reproducibility means they tried to do it themselves and see if they got the same result. So you see, peer review is too low of a bar for verifying scientific results in that way. However, there are problems also on the other side with peer review rejecting stuff it shouldn't. And I wanted to show you this to really get into, how the sausage is made per se. This is actual comments that I got on one of my manuscripts. Now, maybe you think that the manuscript was really this bad. I don't care if you do. But I did also put in some comments from a different peer reviewer on the same manuscript for comparison. So I think that what was going on here, more than likely, was that this guy was threatened because I was writing in his topic area and he did not want competition. But, that said, he wrote some things that I was fairly upset by, and it's okay to laugh about it. People don't often show what peer review comments look like because they can be rather humiliating. But let's just look at them. The authors attempted to compensate for their failure to address basic questions by padding with results that are routine. The best algorithm is backpropagation. The fact they did not mention it suggests they're unaware of this method. In summary, other than the fact they appeared to get their code to work correctly, there's nothing noteworthy about this work. The authors would have us reinvent all these wheels inside their code, and they call that generality. And of course, this is ancient technology that any decent graduate student should be able to figure out by themselves. I have no objection to these statements except that they are uninteresting. Naturally, that paper got rejected. Although I did think that the editor should have been able to detect a significant amount of bias in that review, which they did not. So we made minor changes because there were a few actually pertinent things brought up, and we sent it to another journal and got the following comment back. I think this contribution useful for computational materials scientists in general, and I am happy to recommend acceptance of the manuscript for publication almost as is. That's a rather rare comment, actually. And then, finally, an example from the same second review. This one they sent it to two different people for review. And we got a constructive criticism. I believe the authors should demonstrate the potential is useful, and they gave an example of what they thought we should do. We did that in the revision, sent it back. The reviewers liked it. It was accepted and published last year. So you see, there's a big issue with bias, with competition. I mean, reviewers are human, like everybody else. They make mistakes, they miss things, they have ulterior motives. Others are simply overconfident, or they don't understand your paper as well as they really should to give a good review. The authors, the reviewers that don't understand your work as well as they should tend to fall into two camps: the ones that just accept everything they don't understand, and the ones that reject everything they don't understand. This was one of the latter. For the interest of time, I guess I'll just focus on this last one. Those of you who have had continuum mechanics can appreciate this. The rotation and deformation matrices defined in the paper are not tensors. They are specified in terms of engineering strains, wherein the tensor strains and rotations are summed. For most of y'all, that doesn't make sense. Continuum mechanics is an 8,000 level class. But someone who's reviewing this work should never say that. It's very, very wrong mathematically. The editor also failed to notice that that review was incompetent. So in general, peer review doesn't work. A lot of scientists would prefer this method. But, that's what we have right now. That's the way that stuff gets published. It's not reliable. And yet, most people consider any kind of published work in journals as unquestionable. Why is that? Well, it's because science is their religion. Very explicitly, in fact. It has its own priesthood, it has its heretics, it has its dogmas, its tenets of faith, everything. And it's definitely held to with ardor and faith. You've all heard very often the expression, follow the science, follow the scientists. We believe in the science. What in the heck does that mean? We believe in the science. It doesn't mean anything to do with science at all. What it means is that you should agree with a certain group of opinions approved by those in power, which has nothing to do with the scientific method whatsoever. Likewise, evolution also is a religion, quite explicitly. It has a large number of very fundamental assumptions that are critical for it, which are not taken based on evidence. They are assumptions. For example, our senses, ability to reason, experiences, and memories are reliable. If everything arose by chance, there's no reason to trust our own minds. Nothing exists beyond what our senses or instruments can detect. The materialistic assumption. They do logic on that, even though they can't measure logic. They use math with it, and you can't measure math. It's a rather awkward assumption. Uniformitarianism is reliable. What that means is that you can do forensics on nature. If you have something that's evolving in a certain way now, you can extrapolate it back in the past as far as you want, and it just worked the same way. Very problematic if any kind of discontinuous event has occurred. Anything outside the system that came in, changed things, and went away. Like a tsunami or an earthquake or, anything like that radically changes what's going on locally. The first cell originated without a creator. There is absolutely no data for determining cell evolution in the first place. We can't reproduce it. We can't observe how it happened. There's no fossils. This is completely religious. There's nothing scientific about original cell evolution. Real science must explain everything without alluding to a creator. Again, the materialistic assumption. This one I found in biology textbooks. There's nothing in the scientific method about what kinds of theories are accepted. It's only whether your theory is compatible with the evidence. Complex life forms naturally form from simpler ones. There's no evidence of major evolutionary changes. We only see micro adaptations. Those definitely exist. Finches' beaks get longer and shorter in response to the available food supplies and so on. That doesn't mean that dinosaurs can turn into finches. Those are completely different processes. You cannot extrapolate that. The universe formed on its own at the Big Bang. Again, there's utterly no evidence for determining how the Big Bang happened. We can only see the results. So, evolution is completely religious. Now, they do a lot of science on top of it, but it's founded on religious tenets. So how do you do this? How do you apply the scientific method to evolution as a whole, as a theory? Well, you'll notice that you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to disprove most of it. And so, of course, it's not really a scientific theory, because scientific theories have to be disprovable by the data. But any data that doesn't agree with evolution is just kind of ignored. And of course, those assumptions, there's some major problems with a lot of them, and those are ignored. So, like natural means for the origin of life. We don't have any mechanism to describe how life could originate naturally. The little bit we have showing that you can take amino acids and stimulate them with electricity to do stuff, that's a far cry from developing a functional cell. I mean, that's, if it could be disproven, it would have been. Because that's not good science. The fossil record does not show gradual transitions. It shows distinct kinds of things altogether. Very few things that are called transition species, but when you look at them closer, they almost all are practically identical to either one end or the other of what they say they're a transition between. So it doesn't work. I like this quote. Evolutionists have physics envy. They tell the public that science behind evolution is the same science that sent people to the moon and cures diseases. It's not. The science behind evolution is not empirical but forensic. No testing, no observations, no repeatability, no falsification. I think this is what the public discerns, that evolution is just a bunch of just-so stories disguised as legitimate science. So, this thing I set up at the beginning, the Bible versus science, it's really a false dichotomy, because what we really have are two religions that are fighting it out over the same data, arguing for which one is more compatible with what we see in the world. Also, we see a lot of the arguments made by evolutionists that, that you have to have a natural explanation, all this kind of stuff. That's not true, because their own forefathers in science did not believe that way. They were Christians, most of them. And evolution does not obey the rules that it says science should follow. So, going back a little more broadly, you can be a good scientist and not agree with the scientific consensus. Now, scientific consensus is that evolution is verified and true. That's what the majority of biologists believe, and geologists and so on. That does not mean you have to agree with them to be a good scientist. You do not have to agree with the experts, despite what the proponents of science as a religion say all the time. In fact, most significant advances in science have come from people who managed to verify hypotheses that disagree with the current consensus. Do you all recognize these guys? Yes, that is Einstein, before he became famous. At that time, he worked in a Swiss patent office because he couldn't get a job in academia. He was doing physics on the side as an amateur, practically. I mean, he was very good at it, but he was not working professionally as a physicist. He did not become famous until his results were verified experimentally by Sir Arthur Eddington. Eddington, in 1919, managed to observe a solar eclipse that showed the stars displaced around the sun in exactly the way that Einstein predicted. That went completely against the broad understanding of astronomy at the time. That's when Einstein became a household name. This sort of thing happens all the time. And then we forget that there ever was a broad consensus that was wrong. But, it took these people going completely against the grain of normal thought for a long time to get to that point. So I told you, you don't have to listen to the experts. You don't have to agree to the experts. You should do your own research. But beware, if you do, of confirmation bias, because it's extremely prevalent in people who do their own research. Both professional scientists, amateur scientists, and everyday people. It's just something that people do. This Venn diagram is a good example of it. You have all the facts and evidence available, the part that agrees with what you believe and the part that doesn't, and you only look at the part that is compatible with what you believe, dismiss the rest. If you're going to do good research, you have to look at all of it. You have to have theories that are compatible with all of the evidence. You can't pick and choose. And you can't just go looking for people that agree with you. That's just a different form of the bandwagon fallacy. So you absolutely should do your own research. But don't say that and then not do research. Okay. So science isn't perfect. But that doesn't mean the Bible's reliable either. I mean, we could still go down to the bottom right corner and say neither one of them's reliable. So why should you trust the Bible? Well, here's what Peter said about it. He said, "We have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory, when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.' And this voice which came from heaven we heard when we were with him in the holy mount. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well that you take heed, knowing this first, that no prophecy of the Scripture is of any private interpretation. For the prophecy came not in old time by the will of men, but God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit." So Peter says he personally witnessed God attesting to Jesus. And he says that the scriptures were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So we have the Bible's claim of infallibility here. But we also have Peter saying that he was an eyewitness. He saw this. And he wasn't the only one. Paul writes that at the time of the 1 Corinthians, when he wrote that letter, there were still 300 people alive who had seen Jesus after the resurrection. And in fact, Jesus had once appeared to 500 people at the same time after having risen from the dead. So this is really interesting. This is really significant because, maybe you think that Paul made this up. We have very early copies of the letter of 1 Corinthians, though. Now, he was telling these people, if you don't believe me, you just go ask all of these people that saw it. They're still alive. You can go talk to them. And we have records indicating that 1 Corinthians has not changed, and the other New Testament letters. After Jesus' death, the apostles were scattered until the resurrection, and then they became bold. And all of them except for John were martyred for their faith. So you have to think, how many people would be willing to die for a cause that they knew to be false?
Because we know for certain that the apostles did in fact die for Christianity. That's pretty well verified by extra biblical records. They died saying Jesus was the Messiah. After he definitely had died. So how could they possibly be that dedicated to the idea if they hadn't seen him? I mean, how many people would be willing to lie like that? And we see the explosion of the early church too. I mean, the only reasonable explanation is that these people really did see Jesus. Unlike most other religious worldviews, Christianity is built on historical events and can therefore be proven or falsified by historical investigation. The problem for skeptics and critics is that all the historical evidence points to the resurrection. There are quite a lot of extra-biblical sources that talk about Palestine in the first century, talk about the different events going on, talk about the early church even. They're all compatible with the New Testament. Moreover, looking at the Bible as a whole, there's archaeological stuff we dig up all the time, all over the place. We keep finding more of it. I see, results in the news very often. Scores of archaeological findings which confirm in exact detail historical places, events, people, kings that ruled, all these different things, just like the Bible recorded. Moreover, compared to any other ancient document, the New Testament has excellent source material available. Now, obviously, it's a religious work, so naturally a religious work is going to have a lot more copies. But that being said, the earliest complete copy of the New Testament at AD 125, only 25 or so years after it was finished being written. That's crazy compared to some of these others where the earliest copy we have was, 500 to 1,000 years after the original source was written. So we can be pretty sure that it hasn't changed. Moreover, I find this particularly convincing. You might remember this passage. Many of you will recognize this. I like to think of it as the gospel according to Isaiah. Now, he wrote in chapter 53 here. I'll just read the whole thing. This is good. Who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no stately form or majesty that we should look at him, nor an appearance that we would take pleasure in him. He was despised and abandoned by men, a man of great pain and familiar with sickness. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we had no regard for him. However, it was our sickness that he himself bore, and our pains that he carried. Yet we ourselves assumed that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, and humiliated. But he was pierced for our offenses, he was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment of our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the wrongdoing of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and afflicted, but did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living? For the wrongdoing of my people, to whom the blow was due. And his grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord desired to crush him, causing him grief. If he renders himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, for he will bear their wrongdoings. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the plunder with the strong. Because he poured out his life unto death, and was counted with wrongdoers. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the wrongdoers. Okay, that's a prophecy of the Messiah. Very obviously, right? Very clear. The Messiah was going to come. He was going to die for the sins of the people. The Lord was predestined him to do this. He would suffer. He would be buried with the rich. Lots of details. Here's the significant thing. We have today a copy of the book of Isaiah that predates Christ. In Jerusalem, there's a copy of the book of Isaiah that was found in this cave here that's dated at 125 BC, more than 100 years before Christ was born. We know for certain that this prophecy was written before Christ, and every detail of it was fulfilled according to the best records available by Christ's death. How do you explain that unless the Bible is reliable? Finally, we have creation itself. So Paul writes, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by that which is made, so that they are without excuse." So what evidence is there in creation? Paul says there's evidence in creation, but we have this theory of evolution that's supposed to explain that naturally. Well, there's a lot of things that are really problematic for evolution, such as the life forms appearing very suddenly in the fossil record at the Cambrian layer. No evolutionary transition there. Lots of different, very distinct forms appearing at once. Complex coding in all life forms' DNA. If you have computer code, how do you get computer code without someone writing it? Can computer code just kind of happen in the computer? Complex machinery enabling animals to function as they do. From the way a single cell functions, the way energy is transferred between the cells, the organs, the nervous system, all sorts of complex machinery. We know from our experience, a lot of people here are engineers, machines don't fix themselves. Machines don't arise naturally. They take a lot of work to make, to maintain. They don't just happen. And that goes into the one, everything gets more decayed and disordered over time. So if you backtrack that, then things should have started perfect. Also, math shows us that the concept of perfection is real. I mean, math shouldn't exist if there was no such thing as perfection, because we have these ideas of perfect numbers, perfect sums, things that are exactly right, logic. Where did that idea even come from if there's not a real perfect source? So you have to choose. I gave you an argument that the Bible should be more reliable, should be ranked above science, basically, by telling you some of the problems with science and some of the proofs of the Bible. I think I established fairly clearly that Christianity is compatible with the scientific method, while not compatible with the scientific consensus right now. But in order to be a good scientist, you don't have to follow the scientific consensus. You have to be logical. You have to follow the data, but not what other people say about it. Now, when I tell you, don't listen to the experts, reason it out yourself, of course you have to trust people sometimes. It would take way too long. You can't practically be skeptical about everything and everybody. You have to take some things on faith or you'll never get anywhere in life. But I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb not to trust anybody who tells you not to think for yourself. And I've seen a lot of that lately. Also, it's important to recognize science functions as a religion to many people. And when they make these statements about science, they're saying it as a religious expression. It's not got anything to do with science itself. All this follow the science, believe in the science stuff. That's not science, that's a religion, sciencism or something. So you should exercise critical thinking and evaluate the evidence. So like I said, you can't do that with everything. You have to take some things on faith. So why is this important enough that you need to actually evaluate this one yourself? Here's why. The Apostle Paul writes, "Just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned." Now, Paul was an academic. He wrote things that were very complicated. So I tried to draw a picture of it, which my wife says does not help. But I thought it was a little bit helpful anyway. So Adam rebelled, and the rebellion caused this state of sin. The sin has this natural wages, which is death. So each one causes the next one through this chain here. So we have this perfect man, chooses rebellion, that leads to a state of sin. Adam is now sinful, which means Adam dies, because sin naturally leads to death. Paul goes on, "For if by the transgression of the one death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ." So I tried to also make a diagram of that one. It's very clear he's making a juxtaposition here. He's contrasting and comparing these two individuals, Christ and Adam. And so Christ, in contrast to Adam, he obeyed. And so instead of being in a state of sin, he was in a state of righteousness. And righteousness enabled the gift of life, just like sin caused the wages of death. That's important because it's not just Christ's life. What he's saying is that this life is a gift. Christ's death, because, Christ did die. He didn't just be righteous and therefore win. He did die. He died for these wages up here. You see, the most fundamental thing that Christianity teaches is that Christ came to die to rescue people who were in this state, who could not get out of this state by themselves. And so, in order to escape permanent death, the only way that's possible is by paying these wages. Christ was the only one who could fully pay them because he was the only one who was in this state of righteousness. Therefore, that enables finally this free gift, life available for everyone. All you have to do to receive it is acknowledge that Christ paid this. Acknowledge that he is your Savior and your Lord. Because otherwise, you'll be just stuck here. Now, that's the gospel message. But how does that connect to science? Well, think about this. Christianity has fought and still fights and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution. Because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was made necessary. If you destroy Adam and Eve and original sin, and in the rubble remains the Son of God taking away the meaning of his death. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. If death has always been, then why would you even profess to believe that Christ is going to rescue us from it? How can he make the world perfect again if it never was perfect in the first place? So, final summary. The science disproves it. And there's a lot of different claims that are common in the scientific consensus, but the answer is no. Science cannot conclusively disprove anything because it's iterative. There are viable explanations of the data that agree with the Bible, and there are major problems with the consensus view contradicting the Bible. Now, I realize a lot of you would probably like more detailed answer than that on some of these specific things like millions of years and Noah's flood. But that would take too long. So we're going to have more talks. So I hope you're able to come back. Thank you all for coming. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Somewhat playing devil's advocate, because I think I know the answer to this question. But you said that Isaiah 53 is messianic prophecy, right? Was it regarded as such to the original audience? Would they have considered that a messianic prophecy?
I've read the Essenes did. I don't know about the other Jewish groups.
So it would have been assumed by that group at least that that was talking about the future Messiah.
Nayon?
Thanks for the presentation. So my question is, I know you're a material scientist, and actually material itself looks working perfectly without any interruption of some bug or some entity outside of the material system with the law of the natural law of physics and with some material itself. So actually, no wonder there are a lot of people who believe the materialism, like just material itself is the absolute thing, and for them the best thing that they can pursue through their life is just physical well-being, and it's just it's a cause and effect. But however, in the presentation you said do your research, like you have evidence, and that you can look through all the possibilities, and if this is really the thing that you can believe or not. So my question is, so like in summary, what led you to believe that Bible and the creation and creator is what you can trust and believe?
So that's a really good question. Oh yes. Well, I don't know if I can do it justice, but let's see. So what it boiled down to, I believe, is why did I come to believe the way I do about the Bible, about science, as a material scientist. So, my beliefs started before I became a material scientist, and what I've seen since then has only confirmed them. It was a dual thing for me. But it was the evidence of creation in the world, which is pretty good. And it was the evidence of God in my own life. It was the personal relationship with Jesus Christ was the fundamental thing that underscores to me. I mean, if you talk to God, he's there because he talks back.
So you made a statement that a lot of us scientists, someone who's not a scientist. So why is it that in our culture, in our society, science is presented to us as fact? As if, man, that's it. When you say this is scientifically this, and that ought to be, it should never be questioned, it should never be rejected or anything like that.
That's the same way we present our faith. They're proselytizing.
So further explain when you say science is a religion, further explain that.
So let me go back. I pulled up a definition of religion back here. There. Religion, according to Merriam-Webster, is a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. So, a religion, as I understand it, you have a system of beliefs. That doesn't mean that they are taken completely on faith with no evidence, but it does mean that more evidence isn't going to change them. And it's held to with ardor. You firmly believe this is true. It's important to you. You tell other people about it. You try to convince them that this is right. And with faith, you don't doubt it. It doesn't change. Does that answer your question?
May I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So why do we put any stock, and that's not the right word, I don't want to use the word faith, but why do we put any confidence in science? I mean, if it's a religion, as you described it, and why should we put any confidence in science?
Well, it's because science as a religion and science as the scientific method have been paired together so well that we see all these successes that are due to the application of the scientific method. And people are just kind of shoehorning on these philosophical assumptions of materialism and all, and saying you have to take it all together. And they'll say, the science that enabled us to land a rover on Mars is the same science that says man came from monkeys. And those are completely different things. There's different assumptions. There's different ways of working to get one versus getting the other. But they tell us it's the same thing. And a lot of people don't realize there's any difference.
So you're making a distinction between science as a religion and science as the method of science.
Yes.
So how do we know when we see science that's there is referred to as religion versus scientific method?
It's hard to know for sure. It's hard. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. There's more pizza and drinks, I think. Help yourselves. And we're going to try to have another of these in about a month, I think. Oh, before you go, Sunquan, do you want to pass around like a sign-up sheet? So we have an email list. We'd love to get y'all on it.
Yep.
If you're not getting these already.
You have a monthly meeting like this next month and a month later. If you sign up for the monthly meeting, I'll send you the monthly update. And we have a weekly meeting, next study on a certain topic. So if you want to attend that, we are doing the online meeting. So wherever you are, you can join through the Teams. So we can send you that invitation for that as well. So please write your name and email and your interest monthly meeting. And we'll reach out.
What day?
Oh, yeah. So actually, the weekly meeting happens this time, every Tuesday. Not exactly this time. 12:30, 30 minutes earlier. So we do that 12:30 to 1:30. And everything else available. Monthly meeting, it is flexible. So first or second week of next month. It might be in March.
All right, good deal. Thanks to all of y'all who came online. I'm going to close down the meeting.